You have all decided to join us from whatever part of the world that you are in this morning. Well, it's morning for me, I should say, here in Bend, Oregon. But I know that some of you are joining us from Europe, where it is in the evening. Some might be even joining from the South Pacific, where it is very, very early in the morning. So wherever you are, we thank you for joining us for this very special event to celebrate Sofia Coppola and the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sofia Coppola. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Suzanne Ferriss. I am the editor of the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sofia Coppola, and I am joined today by several of the contributors who I believe that you can see on screen. I am honored that I have my co-host for the event, Shireen Muhyiddin, who is Bloomsbury's head of marketing, who will serve as our co-host today.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for joining us, Shireen. And Shireen will be doing a lot of the work behind the scenes. Before we begin, I want to give you just a reminder that unless you're one of the active speakers, that you please mute your video and audio until the question and answer portion at the end. We're going to give a brief presentation, and then there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end, because we do intend this to be an interactive experience for most of you, we hope. We are here today, myself, Shireen, and all of our wonderful contributors, to celebrate Sofia Coppola and ourselves. I was privileged to be invited to edit the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sofia Coppola. And my assignment was to entice an international group of experts on all things Coppola to contribute to a comprehensive guide to the director's impressive oeuvre, her films and beyond. To my delight and amazement, I managed to convince almost 30 scholars and industry professionals to participate, and with only a little arm twisting. And the people whose arms I had to twist know who they are. And the result is, let me just show you if you haven't already seen, a definitive guide to Sofia Coppola's works in 26 chapters, a definitive guide in 26 chapters to the distinctive blend of art, photography, fashion, design, music, and fame characteristic of her cinema and other works. And I hope you have had a chance to review the table of contents and the full list of contributors. Shireen is going to pop a link to the details in the chat. But I'd like to take a moment, as you're looking over the list, to thank our editor, Anna Coatman, who couldn't be here today, assistant editor, Vedahi Hans, and Camilla Erskine, who I know is out there somewhere, who originated the idea for the book. Thank you, Camilla. And of course, I would like to thank all of the contributors for what I'm sure once you have a chance to read it and to hear what they have to say, you will agree that this is absolutely stellar work. We are joined together today on Groundhog Day, which makes me think about Bill Murray, of course, and we will hear more about him later. And Amy Monahan, who is also joining us in the audience, reminded me that it is Sofia's parents' wedding anniversary. And if you haven't already seen her new book of interviews with Coppola, I would suggest that you check it out. Not all of our contributors who you see here could join us today, but happily many could, to give you a taste of what the handbook offers and to show you Coppola's extraordinary achievements over 3 decades of work. You're going to meet them in groups, and they're organized according to the 5 parts of the book. Since we collaborated on the project during the pandemic, we've never gathered together in person. So this is actually the first time that some of us are meeting each other too. So it's a real treat for us. We've promised to keep our overviews very short so that we'll have time to come together, as I said, as a larger group at the end to answer your questions. Shireen is going to monitor the chat for us, so you can go ahead and post your questions as you go, and we'll circle back to those toward the end. Okay, so I think that I will stop sharing the list of contributors because you've had ample time to look at it and you're going to see them now. So we're going to begin with our first group of contributors. And these are the people who have contributed to the section that we're calling the big screen, which is devoted to Coppola's 7 feature films.
Is your camera on?
No, I turned it off.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I turned it off.
I'm sorry, I am hearing somebody. Sorry. Okay, so the first part is about the big screen, and it's devoted to Coppola's 7 feature films. And in case you don't have them all memorized like we do, they are The Virgin Suicides, Lost in Translation, Marie Antoinette, Somewhere, The Bling Ring, The Beguiled, and On the Rocks. And going in order of the film's release dates, I'll introduce each of the contributors to this section who are joining us today in turn. And that means that first up from the University of Rhode Island is Justin Wyatt, who has written the chapter on Coppola's first feature, The Virgin Suicides, based on his book about the film. Take it away, Justin.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this project. It's amazing to see everyone. It's amazing to read your work. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about my chapter, which is called The Cinematic Style of Loss, Sofia Coppola's The Virgin Suicides. So The Virgin Suicides is an adaptation of the Jeffrey Eugenides novel of the same name. And I feel like this is really an extraordinary debut feature. Kind of a legendary debut feature when you look at it. And what you see is Coppola's skill at setting mood, emotion, and environment, and kind of infusing almost everything within the film with kind of a deep melancholy. And in the chapter, what I do is I talk about the ways that this happens, and there's several. One is through the use of music, through the use of ambient music, particularly the French duo Air, and how she uses Playground Love, that theme in different versions throughout the film, but also very much in a key sequence towards the end of the film in which the boys and the girls talk to each other through playing records. So they play records and they hold them up to the phone. So you start to see how this kind of communication between the boys and girls can't really happen because it's broken by this sort of false artificial means of communication through records. I feel like the visual style of The Virgin Suicides is just extraordinary. And in the chapter, I talk about a couple of different things. One is what I call visual bursts. And these are moments which are sometimes created by the characters or by the environment or an element within the environment in which you see a perfect world. Oftentimes it's a world in which you see the sisters and it's golden light, it's perfectly yellow, everything's wonderful, and you get a sense of kind of reverie or dream. But what's so interesting about The Virgin Suicides and Coppola's work here is how she takes these reveries and she actually bases them on advertising of the 1970s when the film takes place. So when you look at it, you kind of get these strange recollections of these ads from the 70s. And of course, this is a time when there's kind of a fetishization of female sexuality and young female sexuality and exploitation that was happening. So you see this going on. So even at these moments of joy within the film, it's disquieting, it's upsetting, it's uncomfortable to watch because it calls into sharp focus this exploitation. The other thing that Coppola does with the film in terms of visual style is the compositions. So usually what you try and do with a film is connect your viewer to the characters and then the drama. What Coppola does in really extraordinary ways is kind of cut this off at certain times. So there's a scene in which Trip Fontaine talks to Mr. Lisbon trying to get a date with Lux, and it's shot not with the characters, but through a door, through a very small glass image in the door. And everything that you'd want dramatically and emotionally from the scene, Coppola cuts off from you. So it's distancing the viewer. You really can't focus on the emotion directly. You have to focus on the film and these events on an intellectual basis. So yes, the film is upsetting and sad, but it's also very much an intellectual excursion and an intellectual challenge, I feel, rather than purely an emotional or dramatic one. So basically, just to sum up, I would say the music, the visual bursts, and the visual compositions create this melancholy, this loss that is kind of extraordinary, and just the start of an amazing career that we've seen so far. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Justin. And once again, Justin's chapter is based on his book, an entire book about the virgin suicide. So I encourage you to check out both. Okay, joining us from London is Lucy Bolton, who kindly agreed to revisit Lost in Translation after writing previously about the film in her book, Film and Female Consciousness. What did you have to say, Lucy, in your chapter?
Okay, hi everybody. I'd just like to begin by saying that I have chest infections and my voice is very strange, so I'm not going to speak too much, but I'm very pleased I'm able to attend. And thank you, Suzanne and Shireen, and for the event. And Suzanne, thank you so much for enticing me into this beautiful, beautiful book, which I think is also so important. Coppola, it makes Coppola an undeniably really significant filmmaker, and I think that there are lots of people here today whose work has contributed towards doing that, but she really merits this compendium, which is very exciting. Yes, I found Lost in Translation to be an extremely important film in my work, because I remember as I was watching it, I was struck by so many moments when I was aware that we were completely aligned with Charlotte, the Scarlett Johansson's character. And the one that really struck me was when Charlotte's husband, annoying photographer husband, and annoying Hollywood actress are kind of talking over her. And Coppola holds her camera on Charlotte's really quite disgusted face when she's looking at them both with complete disdain. And I remember thinking at the time, this is amazing. This is unusual. How often are we invited to share the perspective? We know how she feels. She's grumpy. She doesn't like these people. As her husband says to her, you can be so snotty sometimes. And the privileging of this young woman's perspective was just a revelation to me. And I think some of the words that Justin has used about mood and about melancholia will clearly reverberate across many of the things that people say tonight. But what revisiting the film enabled me to do was to not focus solely on Charlotte's consciousness, because that is what had gripped me when I first saw the film. What I was able to do here was to try and take a slightly more even-handed approach to the film and look more in the round at how the film demonstrates both isolation, loneliness, the solitary state, and the building of connection and the sharing of moments of connection, and really shows that to be really profound. And in a way, it does no more than that, but that is huge. And so thank you, Suzanne, for giving me the opportunity to explore it as a more of a two-hander, which of course it is, than the singular focus that I had before on Charlotte's character. And I think also it's really great to be able to revisit the film after so many years and see the status that it has. So thank you again, and I hope that everyone gets to read this book, because it's a real mark of respect to Sofia Coppola that she really deserves. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lucy. And I would like to say that Lucy in Film and Female Consciousness was one of many of the scholars whose work inspired my own, and of course, I think some of the other contributors here. And I agree, Lucy, that it's about time that Coppola is getting this kind of comprehensive attention. So thank you so much. Lucy has already spilled the beans that she was one who I had to like, oh, please, Lucy, please. So I am grateful to Lucy for actually agreeing to contribute and revisit the work. Okay, next is Todd Kennedy, who is coming to us from near New Orleans, who's written several articles about Coppola, including her film Somewhere. he agreed to write the chapter on that film, and he also agreed to write the chapter on her Christmas special. And so he will be coming back to talk about A Very Merry Christmas in a little bit. But for now, he's going to talk to us about Somewhere. Take it away, Todd.
I'll keep this very quick because I know we're tight for time, but before I even say what I want to say quickly about this, I just want to say how great it is to see everybody here and how many people are getting to be able to publish on Sofia Coppola. I remember when I wrote my first Sofia Coppola article where a reviewer condescendingly called me young lady and told me that Sofia Coppola had nothing of value and forced me to remove the term feminist or any argument that she had feminist leanings in her films from my article. And I just think that's a world from where we obviously are now. And I think that's good in many ways. My second article was about Sofia, but about Somewhere, largely because I studied both literature and film. My career's pretty much been a film scholar, but my dissertation was on images of the road in literature. So when I went to see Somewhere, it really struck me, its road story. And so I wrote an article that largely looked at modernist and postmodernist implications within Somewhere, and that's what Suzanne Ferriss found and wanted me to write another article about Somewhere. I was worried about how to write a second article about a movie I'd already written about, much like Lucy was just talking about with Lost in Translation. But what I had done the first time, I had simply just kind of referenced American influences on the film, particularly Modern Times, more in depth, briefly, The Graduate, and 5 Easy Pieces. So I used the second article to kind of look at the way in which I think that we don't talk as much as we could about how European cinema influences all of Sofia Coppola's work. And I think most of her influences are European. And so it made me kind of bristle at the idea that Somewhere is her European film, when I actually think in many ways it's her most American film. And I think those are overly simplistic terms to begin with, but within the kind of realm of how it was being read as this European art piece. So I traced influences by Michelangelo Antonioni and Chantal Akerman especially, but I then invert that by how this film in many ways runs away from those influences that have been there throughout her career and actually I think leans towards American New Wave filmmaking more than European. I think Somewhere's, Marie Antoinette is the movie that blew me away, and Lost in Translation and several other films are ones I come back to maybe more often than Somewhere. But I love that. I think what Sofia Coppola does best is let her camera tell her story and let the filmic elements tell her story. And it's why condescending critics want to go after it for lack of plot, which the plots are normally great, but they're not her main thing, which is true of many male directors who rarely get critiqued for it. And I think that's what Somewhere does is it goes all in with that. And it makes you really, what Justin was just saying about shot placement in that scene in Lost in Translation, in Virgin Suicides, I think it's pretty much every shot of Somewhere. And I think that she lets the filmic elements make those arguments. And she does so really to tap into a central trope of American road stories that I think would not have been expected from her based on her first 3 films.
Okay, well, thank you, Todd. And I think as Todd is revealing, Lucy and Todd and Justin, that there has been a great body of scholarship about Coppola's works, and we have the chance to bring it all together into one volume. And I hope that we have succeeded in doing so. Next joining us is Maryn Wilkinson, who is in Amsterdam, and she has written 2 articles about the Bling Ring. And I saw those and asked her if she would kindly extend her argument for us in her chapter for the handbook, which she agreed to do. So welcome, Maryn.
Thank you so much. Just hello from my very sort of cluttered living room here in Amsterdam. I just wanted to first start again by saying thank you so much, Suzanne, for initiating this project, for inviting me to be part of it. And I feel right now like I'm in a room with all of these people whose names on the shelves over the years I've not only admired and looked up to, but who I've always considered to be kindred spirits in our shared love for film. So it really is an honor. Very briefly, I think the main argument I make in my chapter about the Bling Ring is really about the postmodern character of the film. And I think I also kind of argue that for me, it's perhaps her most political film through its sort of profoundly self-reflexive nature and its comments on American capitalism in particular. And many critics, when the film was released, argued that it was really superficial and shallow in its sort of, retelling of this story of teenagers who break into celebrities' houses. But my point is that there are actually many layers of complexity precisely in its engagement with surface. And so that's what I kind of try and break open in the chapter, which again, also my previous work on the film. So I argue that its engagement with surface kind of announces itself, or can best be sort of broken open in two ways. Firstly, we see it in her visual style. So in the film's aesthetics, which I argue can best be defined as sort of sense of skimming. In both the way that we skim through magazines, and the film emulates all of these media forms, social media forms, photo cameras, laptop cameras, surveillance cameras, in the same way as though we're sort of skimming through something, and have a very kind of flânerie, engagement with media forms. But then also that kind of criminal sense of skimming, which we see the teenagers themselves do as they skim the goods out of the cars. And there kind of is an argument to be made, I think, about the way that the film, through its own emulation of media forms, is skimming some of that, right, off the surface, and some of those profits. Secondly, for me, the film engages with surface in very complex ways through its emphasis on performance, which in this film and in a lot of Sofia Coppola's work is sort of closely interwoven with the figure of the teenage girl, who here becomes a kind of hollow vessel, an avatar of sorts that both all other identity markers kind of disappear into, and that just endlessly reproduces and performs itself. And there's so many ways that the Bling Ring plays with that, not only in its casting of somebody like Emma Watson, who was of course known to the public as Hermione at that point, and who here transforms into a sort of Californian trickster, an MTV style media savvy teenage, a Californian girl. But also through the way that the film highlights that all of these girls, and even the gay male character Mark, kind of performs this role of a teenage girl, endlessly preoccupied with image, construction of image, and how they perfect and constantly renegotiate that role. It becomes more complicated even when you tie that to the role that the teenage girl has in late capitalism, where she both shapes the consumer market and is sort of the ultimate consumer of it. And again, the film plays with all of these entanglements in very complex ways, and hollows out the goods, and hollows out, this sort of state of immaterial labor to be one of surface play. And so ultimately, for me, that's why this film is so political and feminist in many ways, but also able to have its cake and eat it too, because it performs its own role in that media landscape as well. Okay, didn't want to go over time. Again, thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Maryn. And I, of course, I agree with what Maryn is arguing about the Bling Ring. And as I'm sure some of you will discuss in at the end, it's probably one of her most underrated films. And I can't tell you how, the attention to form that we can already see is emerging from the contributors in the section on film is the key, as we're saying, to Coppola's cinematic work. And even respected cinema scholars don't get the Bling Ring, and it annoys me. So thank you, Maryn, for giving it its due. And others of you do too in your other work too, so we won't take away from that. Okay, next we have the final presenter about Coppola's individual films is Michelle Devereaux. She's at the University of Warwick, and she has 2 chapters on Coppola in her book, The Stillness of Solitude, one on the Virgin Suicides and another on Marie Antoinette. But for this project, she turned her lens on The Beguiled. So Michelle, tell us what you had to say.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here today to celebrate this book with everyone. I'm really proud of the work that we've all done. I've prepared a little something here because I tend to babble when I speak extemporaneously, so it should come in just about 4 minutes. So in seeing The Beguiled for the first time, it struck me how Coppola's film version of the book by Thomas Cullinan, which was previously adapted into a film by Don Siegel in the 1970s, could be viewed as a sort of descendant of The Virgin Suicides, a film much loved by me, that I have written about previously, as Suzanne says. And for the record, I wouldn't be the first to notice this connection. Both films are about looking, and for their female characters, about being seen. Both feature a similar pretty aesthetic as defined by Rosalind Galt in her book of the same name. This is an aesthetic which attempts to cover over the cracks of violence and trauma in the respective stories. Both are about women being cloistered and eventually imprisoned, and both are about knowledge as much as they are about feeling, specifically the knowledge of how others truly feel. So in that earlier film, the boys think they want knowledge of these fundamentally unknowable girls, but for The Beguiled is much more concerned with the girls' and women's frustrated knowledge of men, typified by one man specifically. They want to know how he feels about them, because how he feels about them defines their views of themselves and their place they feel in society. So here's where it gets a bit philosophical. I apologize, it's a little wonky. Of course, they can't really ever know for sure how he feels, and this relates to the so-called philosophical and skeptical problem of other minds. So for the skeptic, the fact that we cannot access fundamental truths about the nature of reality and other minds, this leads to a shrinking away from life, contradicting the human wish to escape from such subjectivity and isolation. Stanley Cavell raises the possibility that skepticism, particularly the problem of other minds, could be a gendered experience. That is, men and women experience it in different ways. He even writes at one point that skeptical narcissism, as he defines it, might be a male business. For Cavell, the skeptic haunts the world, but he also sees the skeptic as wanting to take revenge upon the world for this perceived isolation. And this is the potential male business he's talking about. But for me, Coppola's version of The Beguiled encapsulates this idea of other mind skepticism from the woman's point of view, or rather the points of view of several women and girls. So in my chapter, I've put Cavell's ideas about skepticism, gender, and revenge into dialogue with Simone de Beauvoir's ideas on the internalized inessentialness and otherness of womanhood in relation to maleness. To me, the film is essentially about women grappling with the idea of their own freedom, encapsulating what Beauvoir has called, quote, the ambivalence of desire and anxiety, end quote, experienced by the feminine subject. So Coppola's use of both the male and female gaze highlights the ambiguous and ambivalent nature of this desire. The women want to look, to desire, to assert their autonomy, but they also want to be seen and in their minds validated by a man's desire. But they also unconsciously resent the notion of the maleness of freedom and the fact that male approbation defines them. Initially, they express profound doubts as to their male captive McBurney's feelings and true motivations. Can he really be trusted? Soon, however, they are jockeying for his attention and approval. They desire McBurney's sense of personal freedom and autonomy, experiencing it vicariously. At the same time, they fear their own freedom deeply because it comes from the loss of a sense of their place in the world. So my chapter basically looks at the complex interplay between these women's conflicting desires and skeptical doubts and how it plays out in this battle of the sexes scenario context of the film. I write about how Coppola uses the gaze and her pretty aesthetic to describe this conflict, the implications of the Gothic and the so-called racial erasure of the film on feminine subjectivity, and the expressed ambivalence of both freedom and revenge. And that's me. Thank you very much. Thanks, Suzanne.
I tried to mute so that you guys wouldn't hear me, not to do that. Okay, as you can tell, thank you. Michelle's is a very complex reading of The Beguiled, but she very easy to read. As I would point out, all of the chapters are, despite the complexities of their arguments. It's amazing to me how people can write so well and so clearly about such complicated issues. So that gives you, I think, a very good taste of the kinds of approaches that the contributors are taking to Sofia Coppola's film work. to her works intended for the big screen. But one of the other things we wanted to do in the handbook was to point out that her contributions to art go beyond simply her contributions to cinema. And so we have another section called Smaller Screens and Streaming, because in the second part of the book, we wanted to highlight how her achievements extend beyond the cinema. Because in addition to her feature films for the screen, she has crafted a series of works that are shorter or intended for smaller screens, including a short film. She's done music videos, a Christmas special, and commercials for fashion brands. And that doesn't include, as you'll also hear later on, she's done an opera, she did a film for the New York City Ballet Gala. She's done an awful lot in the short form, and that hasn't received, in our mind, sufficient attention. So I was very lucky to have Cynthia Felando, who from Santa Barbara, California, who edits the journal Short Film Studies, who agreed to write an entire chapter about a short film that gets mentioned, but hasn't really been given detailed treatment. And so Cynthia will tell us what she has to say about Lick the Star.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm so proud of being a part of this project with so many esteemed scholars. It's just such a great group. I've used a lot of your work in my own work and in my teaching. So I wrote about Lick the Star, as Suzanne mentioned. It's Sofia Coppola's first solo directed film and her only non-commercial narrative short, which she made in 1998. In writing the piece, I wanted to consider the film on its own terms and as a short film specifically that uses short film conventions, and which is now an important part of the short film canon. Even though Lick the Star is only 14 minutes long, it packs a complex narrative and stylistic punch, which made it really fun to write about. I position it as a bold and subversive and modern short, especially for the ways in which it centers a fascinated girl's gaze and very decidedly not an objectifying or sexualized male gaze. My primary aims in general were to consider the many ways that it focuses on girl culture and a contemporary girl's gaze. In the piece, I describe Lick as a melodramatic, girl-centered middle school saga about power, stardom, poison, treachery, and survival. The story involves a small clique of middle school girlfriends who engage in a lot of high drama, especially by way of a top secret plan that includes rat poison, which brings some excitement and purpose to their dull, contained suburban lives. As for the girl gaze, I note the ways in which we're most aligned with the character of Kate by way of point of view shots and her voiceover. She has some wonderful voiceovers, including "I dreaded going back. Missing school was like a death wish." The object of Kate's gaze is Chloe, the film's protagonist and a super stylish leader of the Mean Girls clique, who's devised the flowers in the attic inspired scheme to poison a few of their boy classmates as payback for what seems to be routine sexual harassment. Coppola also gives Chloe one of the most ferocious character introductions in all of cinema history as she glides catwalk style toward the camera in slow motion as a super high octane punk song plays on the soundtrack. So for context, I situate the film in relation to the influential and generally then familiar cultural and artistic sensibilities associated with the Riot Girl movement, and it's girl with 3 R's. This is a radical feminist youth and cultural movement that emerged in the early 1990s. Many girls and young women embraced Riot Girl for its radical third wave feminist inspiration, including for how it celebrated a wide range of femininities and generally embraced girl culture. So I spend a fair bit of time discussing how Lick the Star's modern and hard-edged and very woman-oriented musical cues and song fragments are mostly from songs by women-led punk bands, including a few from bands that were fronted by the big star rock goddesses, including Kim Gordon and Kim Deal, who would have been familiar to many girls and young women in the 1990s. And also, really importantly, those song fragments reflect the Riot Grrrl movement's origins in the punk music realm, especially by way of the women-led punk rock band Bikini Kill. And I talk about Lick's cheeky humor from its crispy, dry comedy pretty much throughout to a wild and hilarious silent movie slapstick style montage. And a lot of the film's humor is found in its over-the-top rendering of middle school girl angst and general Sturm and Drang, which is a kind of sensibility that Sofia Coppola would work again, and I think divinely so, in her feature-length films and other works. So that's part of what I did in the piece. And if you haven't seen Lick This Star, I all the way recommend it. So thanks, Suzanne.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. Yes, and I do, obviously you should read Cynthia's chapter about the film, but you should watch the film. Beautiful black and white, really gorgeous film. And along those same lines, people have not given enough attention, we thought, to Coppola's television special, A Very Merry Christmas. Once again, it gets mentioned occasionally, but we thought that it was deserving of a chapter-length volume. And Todd kindly agreed to write a second chapter focused on A Very Merry Christmas. So Todd Kennedy is back to talk about what he had to say about A Very Merry Christmas.
So A Very Merry Christmas, A Very Merry Christmas does absolutely everything a Christmas special is supposed to do, and absolutely none of it matters. It basically works as a inversion, or I hate to use the word postmodern because I lean towards Sofia Coppola as a modernist, but this is pretty postmodern reinversion of Sofia Coppola, of the Christmas genre. And I've kind of been fascinated with it since it came out, totally on a fan level. Like, I think I just watched it over and over every year and never really thought about it that seriously. Maybe one of the few things out of work I didn't think about that seriously. And when Suzanne was looking for somebody to write it, I started talking it through with my wife, and I started thinking about it. And instead, it's really kind of, if I had another 1,000 words to add to either article, it would be to this article. Or any article I've ever written. I feel like I could have gone longer with it. And I was originally wasn't sure how I was ever going to get 6,000 words out of A Very Merry Christmas. But I end up using, and I intentionally draw a very popular and critically renowned male director who is lauded for many of the same things that Sofia Coppola is attacked for, and Robert Altman, as a lens to kind of understand the way in which both use realism as an aesthetic to deconstruct the artifice of cinema. And then I think that's largely what, in many ways, it's not what drives the criticism of Sofia Coppola. Quite honestly, I think pure sexism drives a lot of the criticism of Sofia Coppola. But one of the things that I think that's behind a lot of the sexist overtones of the little girl kind of terminology that's in a lot of the criticism of Sofia Coppola is this an inability to understand how realistic her cinematography is, how realistic her mise-en-scene is, while at the same time, she's not really that interested in realism as an endeavor. And I think that's something that she shares with Robert Altman. I don't think she gets it from Robert Altman. I don't think she's consciously trying to copy Robert Altman. In fact, I think she, in many ways, is more interested in Robert Altman. But I think that both of them use realism largely as a tool to attack the idea of realism in cinema. So I compare, I talk about both their filmographies in general, but I primarily go for Prairie Home Companion, which is Robert Altman's last film. It's an ensemble cast. It's a deconstruction of another musical genre. And then I use that to then set up A Very Merry Christmas, and the way in which it draws attention both to the way in which it's technically doing everything a Christmas special should do, and draws attention to how it's not really making any of those things important. None of the songs that matter are really about Christmas at all. In fact, the songs that are traditional Christmas songs get cut off or mocked. That only works in a dream sequence, which then is drawn attention to. On basically every level, it uses this kind of realism of space and connection and emotional connection within this hotel lobby to deconstruct the entire genre of Christmas specials, which are normally this over-the-top performance of emotion with very little emotion at all, which then gives her a space for her camera work to provide emotion as it does in most of her films.
Thank you, Todd. And I remember our exchange when Todd said, I really don't know if I'm going to be able to write an entire chapter about A Very Merry Christmas. So thank you very much, Todd. As you will see, he has an awful lot to say. And I think we can see that one of the threads here is that a lot of Coppola's work has been undervalued, particularly in relation to the works of other male directors. And I'm sure we will have lots to talk about that later. But for now, another area that's very close to my heart, given my interest in fashion, is the fact that her commercial work had not been given a lot of attention. I did so in my own book, The Cinema of Sofia Coppola. But we're joined today by Caryn Simonson, who comes to us from the Chelsea College of Arts at the University of London, who has written about luxury in fashion advertising, primarily on the subject of motorcycles, which is how we come to know each other. But she discusses Coppola's commercial work, especially her recent mini films for Chanel, which I'm sure Caryn is going to encourage you, but I would encourage you to go out and just type in Coppola commercials and take a look at her commercial work. Justin talked about some of that in the beginning of his book on the Virgin Suicides too. So there's a lot to say about her commercial work. But Caryn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I'm just to say that thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this and be part of this extraordinary group of scholars. The chapter that I'm working on is around advertising, and I start off broadly exploring Coppola's advertising commercial films for fashion, but look particularly at what I call the fashion mini film, and examine more specifically the case studies of in homage to Mademoiselle for Chanel, and also the Chanel 19 bag. So Suzanne invited me to talk about the advertising because of my work previously on Chanel in relationship to fashion and motorcycling. So I do discuss the films through a form of visual analysis of both the pace and the structure, as well as a focus on gender representation and woman, who Coppola selects, who Coppola leaves out, and how through her re-representation of woman, she kind of she presents the faces of Chanel in homage to Mademoiselle, how she represents those formally through the structure and the kind of cut and splicing of archive footage and film footage, photography and advertising from Chanel's archives. I link some of that kind of form to also the way that she has worked with the Chanel 19 bag film as well, and also connecting it to the kind of fractured, famous mirrored Chanel staircase in Chanel's atelier, with the kind of fractured and kind of repetition, drawing upon Judith Butler's idea of the performance of gender as a stylized repetition of acts. So then I look at the kind of video collage and the splicing that she uses to look at the form of that and how that relates to woman. And in a sense, through that representation of the faces of Chanel, she's representing woman. In an interview with Edith Bowman, she talks about how she puts woman at the center of the stage in her films and in her work. And she does this through the kind of actors as the faces of Chanel, the very varied shaped faces of Chanel. And simultaneously, this affords her an opportunity to present different types of women, albeit limited, through the Chanel brand, in terms of race, age, and sexual orientation, in ways that maybe I feel she hasn't done so much in some of her cinematic films. And the cinematic films generally, apart from the bling ring, have seemed to be very slow, lingering. The word melancholy has been used. They're very dreamlike. But in these two films, fashion mini films in homage to Mademoiselle and also the Chanel 19 bag, the pace is very staccato. It's very kind of strobe lighting. So it's extremely different and in contrast. Having said that, some of her other work in advertising, like the Daisy in Marc Jacobs, does nod very obviously to the Virgin Suicides, and does have that sense of her previous her cinematic films. So I examine it kind of structurally, but also around this idea of woman and who is the woman that she's presenting. So with the Chanel 19 bag film, that has more kind of connections that I explore to the bling ring, both aesthetically in terms of color, but also in terms of that kind of brashness around the Chanel bag, the bling of the Chanel bag with its kind of quilted signature kind of texture, and then also with the kind of gold chains. So you get this kind of kaleidoscopic bombardment of consumption and multiple bags almost thrown at you in this kind of video collage. They call it her film's video collage on the Vogue, in Vogue, and on the Chanel site. So I kind of make some of those kind of connections and links, and then also wonder what the future will be like in terms of where she'll move to next in terms of putting woman center stage. So yeah, that's kind of a succinct summary, hopefully, chapter.
Thank you. I heard most of that. And I'm sure that
Thanks, Suzanne.
as you will see, her chapter is a brilliant discussion. And I think what we can see as one of the threads that we are also trying to explore in the handbook is the attention to her film form, whether it is in the large scale cinematic works or in her smaller works. So we devote an entire section of the book to her film style, which is an audio-visual fusion that is so distinctive that it's been called Coppolism. There are actually YouTube videos that show you how to make a Sofia Coppola film. And in the handbook, we wanted to highlight these distinctions. And so we devote individual chapters to her distinctive uses of music, which we've already touched on, her collaborations with cinematographers to achieve her visual style, and her storied attention to production design, as well as the influences she mines from art, photography, and fashion. And I am delighted that today we're joined by Cynthia Baron, who is in Bowling Green, Ohio, and her co-author, Yannis Tzioumakis, who is in Liverpool, who collaborated on a chapter on how actor performances and the indie wood context of her filmmaking converge in her films. So Cynthia and Yannis are here to talk about those two dimensions in her works. Okay.
Thank you so much. And this is a terrific collection. We're excited to be part of it and are very grateful. And we hope that our chapter complements the other terrific chapters, which I have been reading, and they're just incredibly well written. And, you know, it's a scary group to hang out with because this is a lot of smart people. At any rate, our chapter analyzes Coppola's films in relation to their complex industrial context and the rich aesthetic traditions found in contemporary American independent cinema. Our inquiry dispels the misogynistic notion that her star-studded films reflect little more than her privilege as a second-generation filmmaker, illustrating instead that her collaborations with star actors exemplify indie-wood practices. Our chapter also examines the surface of performances in her films and shows how they employ a combination of naturalistic, modernist, and postmodern strategies that make Coppola's films distinct from Hollywood and even other indie-wood productions. We'll start with the industrial context.
And that's a cue for me. Thank you very much again, Suzanne, for inviting us to do this chapter. And of course, another great opportunity for me to work with Cynthia. So Sofia Coppola's entire oeuvre is associated with a very specific mode of filmmaking in American cinema, one that is identified with the term Indiewood. In our chapter, we approached Indiewood as a step in a constantly evolving American independent cinema in the last 4 decades. And that step established its presence in the late 1990s as independent cinema was getting increasingly closer to the Hollywood majors, whose specialty film divisions such as Paramount, Classics and Vantage, Focus Features, Fox Searchlight, financed, produced, and released more audience-friendly films than earlier modes of independent cinema. These films were characterized, as you can see here, by the presence of Hollywood stars, whose performance often broke away from the star personas, a strong emphasis on genre, executed in playful and subversive ways, attention to marketing so that the films can connect with substantial audience constituencies, and the packaging of all these under the auspices of a very, very strong authorship. Now, as is clear, most of Sofia's films fit this framework like a glove. Her first film, for example, The Virgin Suicide, was released by Paramount Classics. Coppola admitted that she only managed to secure funding after she had cast Kathleen Turner and James Woods, stars past their peak but recognizable Hollywood names nonetheless. The films focus on the story of the 5 young Lisbon sisters, and the participation of young stars Kirsten Dunst, Josh Hartnett placed The Virgin Suicides in teen film territory, which helped with the film's marketing. But Coppola also subverted expectations by creating an ambiguous text that is only partly about growing up. Not surprisingly, critics immediately saw in Coppola a major new filmmaker charting her own career path away from the shadow of her famous father. Now, Lost in Translation further confirmed that, as it became one of the most celebrated Indiewood film examples. Released by Universal Specialty Film Division Focus Features, it featured superstar Bill Murray and up-and-coming star Scarlett Johansson, as well as another story steeped in genre, a romantic comedy this time, but done in a way that also subverted expectations. The 2 stars received huge attention at the time, but it was Coppola who became the main entry point for a critical engagement with the film, taking her place as an Indiewood auteur among a select group of mostly male filmmakers. And thinking here of the 2 Andersons, Alexander Payne, and so on. Marie Antoinette took Coppola to a major Hollywood studio, Sony, but at a time that when even studios would take some risks and back up productions that were much closer to the Indiewood spirit. While Somewhere and The Bling Ring had affinities with the earlier modes of independent cinema, as they lacked major stars and were not as easy to market. The Beguiled brought her back to Focus Features and firm Indiewood territory, while her association with A24 and streamers such as Netflix and Apple TV have brought her close to what Cynthia and I have called late Indiewood, and further evolution of the Indiewood film model following the closure of most of the specialty film division and the emergence of new types of companies in the 2010s. Given this very specific framework, our argument is that the actors' performance in Coppola's films are also Indiewood framed, which is what Cynthia will talk about for the next few minutes of these presentations. Thank you.
So yes, so whether filled with stars or lesser known actors, Coppola's films often employ the cool modernist aesthetic exemplified by Jarmusch's 1984 film, Stranger Than Paradise. Yet, as in Jarmusch's work, the minimalist performances in Coppola's films have a surprising poignancy. Even when they emphasize disengagement and blankness rather than well-rounded individuality, we find that they communicate presence and suggest that emotion is still there, barely visible under the surface. Like other art cinema and independent film narratives that have a drifting episodic quality and complex characters who act inconsistently or have vague goals, in Coppola's work, the momentum of action gives way to the moment of gesture in the body, which is a quote from Alcesser. These moments tend to create empathy for individuals often adrift or uncomfortable in their bubbles of affluence, even as the narrative's predominantly distanced tone expose or critique power dynamics, celebrity culture, gender norms, so forth. The contrast between Hollywood conventions and Coppola's use of modernist performances is most visible in Somewhere, which I'm sure Todd and I could talk about for about 50 hours, but retains a connection to Indiewood through its focus on the effects of stardom. So in Somewhere, Stephen Dorff and Ellie Fanning's portrayals have dramatic power precisely because the actors' sustained absence of visible emotion gives their slightest expression of thought or feeling significance. So for example, throughout the film's first hour, Dorff and Fanning offer few signs of emotion and barely even look at one another. However, following an evening of gelato-fueled father-daughter camaraderie, Cleo learns that her father then spent the night with a female admirer, and so at a really awkward breakfast, Fanning glares at Dorff as he responds with a pleading look. And this fleeting connection begins to crack the isolation surrounding each of the characters and reveals how naturalistic moments of expression are the surface details that give audiences emotional access to Coppola's characters. In The Bling Ring, Coppola also includes evocative naturalistic performance details in the film's mix of non-mainstream aesthetic strategies. So as other contributors point out, Emma Watson's postmodern press interview performances create emotional distance, yet Israel Broussard's understated naturalistic depiction of Mark engages audiences' empathy, starting with his frustrated sigh and chagrined grimace, prompted by seeing his uncool image in his bedroom mirror. In The Beguiled, performances involve more naturalistic choices, and the respective star images of Nicole Kidman, Colin Farrell, and Kirsten Dunst enhance audience impressions about their characters. But even this more identifiable Indiewood film features Coppola's well-known blending of engagement and detachment, as Farrell's depiction conveys that his character continually performs sincerity, humility, and even love, just as Kidman's portrayal signals the many times that she performs genteel civility. And so by generating both involvement and distance, this film illuminates the profound challenges of the characters' respective social circumstances, and thus creates at least an understanding of their actions. And that is our bit about our chapter.
Well, thank you both so much. And I think that, as you can see in the chapter that Cynthia and Yannis have co-authored, we actually get 2 chapters in one. It's a very interesting chapter combining both attention to the business side, but also deep dive into performance. And it's absolutely eye-opening on both fronts. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
We also then had to, of course, have a catch-all section that we're just calling interpretations, because as you can see, Coppola has such a rich oeuvre that there are so many ways that you can actually analyze her films from so many different perspectives. And in that section, we have a range of perspectives from gender and race-based analyses to the ideas of auteurism, curation, the idea of how she uses place, and also how celebrity is not only something that involves Coppola, as Sara is going to talk about in a minute, but also how it features as a theme in her films, as we've already discussed. So we're joined by 2 of the contributors to that very big section today. And the first is coming to us from Sweden is Anna Backman Rogers, who you will know as the author of her excellent book, Sofia Coppola, The Politics of Visual Pleasure. And she argues in favor of reading Coppola's works as a form of feminist politics. And she does that in her chapter, building on her previous work, but also considering On the Rocks and some of Coppola's newer works. So, Anna.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to this incredible book, Suzanne, and it's really exciting to be amongst so many Coppola fans. I haven't prepared anything particularly special. I'm afraid that I just decided I was going to read out the conclusion to my chapter, which I hope I won't do in too much of a tedious style. But I've noticed I've also forgotten my glasses, so I'm going to use this picture of Barbie by Marlene Dumas as a death's head as my line marker, which I think somehow Coppola would appreciate. Okay, and I hope I can stick to under 4 minutes. I don't think it's that long. In this brief survey, I have tried to establish central facets of Coppola's filmmaking that mark her out clearly as an important and established voice in feminist filmmaking, namely, that her films elucidate the manifold ways cinema functions as a technology of gender, and that her films offer an excoriating indictment of cultures that render the female body a commodified object. My contention throughout is that the female point of view or position is a political one, and thus that these films are most suitably read through feminist philosophies of difference. To be clear, I am neither arguing that these films are presented solely through the female gaze, although this is manifestly the subject of a film like The Beguiled, nor am I arguing that Coppola herself is a feminist. Rather, I am arguing that the films in and of themselves manifest a form of feminist politics. As such, I am writing of a politics of the feminine and of the pretty, to the extent that these terms are culturally in contradistinction to inherently or essentially braided. The distinction is important. The beguiling surfaces of Coppola's films serve a radical and not merely celebratory purpose. They ask that we, as viewers, attend with patience and care to the imbricate nature of the feminine and the pretty or decorative, and by extension, to unpack what the purpose of this alliance might be. That this is the work that Coppola demands of us as viewers is, I must stress, far different from endorsing patriarchal regimes of the image. Her films do not solder women to iconicity, but reveal the burden that they carry through complex processes of identification that precede even their entry point into language. The answers to the questions she poses cinematically each and every time palpate the boundaries of abject loneliness, isolation, depression, self-harm, or self-sabotage, and this is cardinal to us understanding the political affect of Coppola's work. Hers is a deeply cerebral cinema in that she thinks first and foremost in images. That is, Coppola possesses an exacting knowledge of how images come to work on us and to form our gendered subjectivities, our ways of existing in the world physically and politically. Her cinema is also deeply rooted in the mental or inner life of women, and by refusing to slip in under the surface of those images, by choosing to remain merely beguiled, we miss this extraordinary quality of Coppola's diegetic worlds. Coppola is not only concerned with the material and embodied encounters of young girls and women, she is also sincerely invested in their psychic experiences, the internal wounds that they carry, and the daily social, cultural, and spiritual attritions that prevent them from living as effective agents in the wider world. That she centres a definitively feminist struggle to carve out sites of contestation from which it is possible to write counter-narratives. In essence, that she documents the struggle to say I is nothing less than radical in a world that all too often continues to privilege the male point of view as a position of unimpeachable articulation and power. That's me.
Thank you so much, Anna. And as you will see, Anna develops that over a series of analyses, close analyses of 3 films, building on her previous work. And joining us from Clemson, South Carolina, is Jamie Ann Rogers, who is taking on, I think, one of the most persistent criticisms of Coppola, which is that her films neglect other political considerations beyond feminist politics, and those related to race and class. So Jamie, I'm sure everyone is eager to hear what you had to say.
Well, thank you. Am I unmuted? Yeah, I am. Okay. So thank you, Suzanne, for making this event happen and this wonderful volume happen, and everybody for being here today. And I am afraid that I'm a little of an outlier here because while I agree with everything that's been said today, I am focusing largely on critique. And so, as Suzanne noted, criticism of Coppola's films is, in terms of their lack of attention to race and classes, nothing new, and it's hardly disputable. But I'm not particularly interested in my chapter in, bemoaning the bourgeois whiteness of her films, but rather thinking about the ways that race and class do function. In particular, because I agree with readings like the one that Anna just provided and that many others have pointed to today that lay out the important feminist interventions of Coppola's formal strategies. But when I approach Coppola's films, I can't help but think about Toni Morrison's argument that signs of Blackness in US literature have historically been used to shore up and fortify whiteness in the collective consciousness. And so in my chapter, I expand on this, and I argue that in Coppola's films, signs of race and class difference, which show up largely by way of omissions and oblique references, also function to shore up and fortify a collective consciousness. But in this case, a white Western feminist one that unfortunately, and I argue, compromises Coppola's feminist interventions. And I'll point to one quick example from her latest film, On the Rocks, because this is the only film in all of Coppola's body of work that stars a woman of color, Rashida Jones. She plays Laura, and features other Black characters, including Dean, who's Laura's husband, and he's played by Marlon Wayans. So the plot of On the Rocks is simple. Laura's come to suspect that Dean's cheating on her. She confides in her white, high-rolling father, Felix, played by Bill Murray, who convinces Laura to accompany him, chasing Dean around the city so that they can catch him in the act. And it becomes increasingly clear that Felix is really enjoying this caper. More importantly, though, he's enjoying spending time with his daughter. So while On the Rocks in many ways is about distance and disconnection in a postmodern world and a critique of sort of old school misogyny, I argue that its plot points could have come from the era of Coppola's Civil War film, The Beguiled. And that's white men protecting their daughters, who they essentially own. Felix opens the film saying Laura will always be his. So white men protecting their daughters against a presumed Black threat, white men falsely accusing Black men of transgressions, and white men using Black men's bodies for their personal gain. So while Felix is exposed as a bygone relic of a misogynistic past, he's nevertheless presented as a somewhat likable one. And the film concludes by enacting a white liberal fantasy of absolution when the mixed race Laura, who's sort of representative of a multicultural racial unity in the film, the fantasy of Western universalism, she sort of wryly forgives Felix at the end. She doesn't, maybe absolve, absolution is a bit too strong of a word, but there is a forgiveness at the end. So to wrap up, I'll just note that the brilliance of Coppola's work is precisely in its undermining of masculine control of feminine images and its deft maneuvering within worlds of excess and within liminal spaces between critique and desire, its thoughtful expressions of, the toxic effects of misogyny and myopia. And I would argue that this is, she deals with the toxic effects of this on both white women and white men. But within these moments of cinematic subversions, Coppola's work remains largely expressive of universal, i.e. white, gendered patriarchy. And by focusing on the universal, the films minimize the particularity of patriarchy as a race and class-based system, and ultimately produce a white feminist worldview that serves the very system it aims to subvert. And that's it.
Thank you, Jamie. And I think that as Jamie is pointing out, she's attending to some of the unseen in Coppola's works. Once again, like the other chapters in the volume, really attending to what's in the images and what's not. And as you can also see from this very brief taste, the chapters in the interpretation system section, and I would say in the volume as a whole, are really in conversation with each other. So you can see how there's lots to discuss, and we will have time for that because we have one more presenter. In our final section, We consider how Coppola's works and Coppola herself have been received by film critics. So there's a chapter on that whole critical reception, by the Academy, and by popular audiences. We were to be joined by one of the members of a group from Monash University in Australia. They have collaborated on a chapter about teaching Coppola's works, focusing in particular on the virgin suicides. So there's a marvelous chapter on how you might use Coppola's works in the classroom. But a sick baby intervened. So we will not get to hear from them. But we do have, thankfully, from Bologna, Sara Pesce, who has written previously about branding in the bling ring. And she argues in her chapter that audiences have transformed the director into a cosmopolitan icon by circulating Coppola-related content globally on social media, image sharing sites, and YouTube. So Sara is going to tell us more about what she has to say about the popular reception of Coppola herself and her works. Sara.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be part of this book's launch and honored and grateful to be part of a terrific group. Honored to represent here the part on reception, actually. Only a few words on my approach to the issue of the worldwide appreciation to Sofia Coppola. What do people think of Sofia Coppola in Italy, for instance? Which spheres of consumption, lifestyle are involved? And why in the blog sphere on the social networks do we express our appreciation, share our experiences or sensibilities similar to Sofia's? I started considering Coppola's impact on international audiences, especially in Europe, not so much from the point of view of the film awards she received, but within realms that are scarcely considered appropriate to a filmmaker. And I started precisely from the opera. As a scholar who had studied Coppola as a celebrity, I attended the Traviata she directed in 2016 in Rome. Valentino made the costumes. What I found was sumptuous. In the first place, a Baroque imagination. When I was inside the theater's foyer at the Teatro dell'Opera, what happened was that I bumped into Willem Dafoe. He was there as a spectator of the show, and my first curiosity was, how can Hollywood celebrities, American filmmaking, contemporary indie cinema influence opera going in Italy? That is, attract audiences towards opera in a different way, and also in Japan. That's where my trip started. Secondly, I needed to assess the liaison between the contemporary history of the Palais of Versailles in France and the film imagination created by Coppola's Marie Antoinette. It is the literal, factual influence the film production had on repositioning the historical site in relation to French political culture. This implies readjustments of the popular notion of French monarchy, of the meaning of being a queen, with exorbitant parallels to Hollywood celebrity. This cultural fact involves the mass phenomenon of people coming from all over the world to visit the site, drawn by the film's inspiration, shopping souvenirs, posting their experience on the social networks, appropriating the idea of the last queen of France by participating in her lifestyle. I confess I have been a serial visitor of the Palais myself several times. And these are the core ideas driving my interest in the consumption of Sofia Coppola as a cosmopolitan practice, so to say. Consuming content related to Sofia Coppola is marked as an educated form of self-surveillance. It becomes a vehicle for women's global citizenship. It is defined by exquisite tastes and love for artifacts of contemporary urbanity. Coppola is made the object of a cultural consumption based on the logic of distinction, which widely embraces fashion, design, music, leisure, one that reproduces material and symbolic inequalities. This is part of my point. Coppola achieves the status of cosmopolitan icon, yes, but she does so trespassing the limits of a Euro-American white male tradition of cosmopolitanism. That's why I include an Asian perspective to my analysis and the whole arc of participatory culture until it's branching into a new television culture, including YouTube, its ludic component, and the spectator's audacious attitude in crossing and mixing. But I don't want to anticipate too much on this, and I would rather leave it to the pleasure of reading the book, the whole book, of course. So enjoy.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Okay, and I think that Sarah, it was good to end with Sarah because I think she gives you a great sense of how international we intended the book to be, not only by the international group of contributors, but trying to widen our approach to look at Coppola beyond certainly the Anglo-American context. So I hope that everyone who is watching and all of the contributors will join me in raising a glass of whatever celebratory beverage or glass of water or coffee you have. I took the liberty of getting, I had to, right? A little Sofia sparkling wine. Yes, and please unmute yourselves, those of you in the audience, if you'd like to. I see my friend Garrett is already ready with his glass. So here's to the marvelous contributors, to the Bloomsbury Handbook, to Sofia Coppola, to Shireen for helping us market it, to all of you for joining us today. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers.
Here's to Suzanne. Thank you,
Here's to
Suzanne.
Suzanne.
Cheers.
Oh, thank
Suzanne.
you.
Suzanne.
Really, I did
Thank
nothing. What a
you.
privilege this was, as you can tell. How much fun could one person have? And so many interesting things to read and discuss, and it was an absolute honor. Okay, so I know we've given everyone, including the contributors, who I'm sure have not had a chance, I'm sure, to read everything in the book either, a chance to think about things, and I'm sure you have questions. And so we would like to open it up to you to ask your questions of the contributors. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your question, or if you'd like, you can pop one into the chat. I'm not seeing too many questions in the chat yet. And thank you all for your patience too with some of our technological glitches. But does anyone want to go first, or would you like me to? It looks like you would like me to. Okay, while you're thinking. Okay. All right, here's one thing that we did not get to is Coppola's use of genre. I mean, we touched on it a little bit. I mean, Michelle talked a little bit about the Southern Gothic, and some people have mentioned how she riffs, well, of course, Todd talking about A Very Merry Christmas and the Christmas special genre, but she's done things across the board. She's done a coming of age, things described as a coming of age, a romantic comedy, biopics, a Southern Gothic melodrama, a heist flick, I think you could say The Bling Ring is, even a buddy film on the rocks, but none of them neatly fits the conventions. She had planned to do a fairy tale. She was going to do a version of The Little Mermaid that would be like filmed underwater. And then she realized she couldn't do that. It was going to be too complicated, although Avatar just has, I guess. And she was working on a script for a vampire film when the idea for Somewhere came to her. And Cynthia and Todd, of course, we could talk. That's my favorite, my personal favorite. We could talk about that for like hours, but so that took over. So she didn't do the vampire film. So with that, all of those ideas in your head, what genre of film would you like to see her attempt that she hasn't? And why? Okay, Lucy.
Okay, hi. I think that's one of the most interesting things about her thank you for raising it, Suzanne, because I think when I compare her to someone like Ang Lee, who to me takes every genre and kind of turns it into a cartoon, what Coppola does is she takes all these genres and she reworks them, she re-envisions them so subtly and so beautifully. I think it's a really incredibly important strand in her work. I would love to see her do a proper thriller, a great, you know, a police procedural. Imagine what, you know, a police procedural with a murder would look like with Coppola doing it. I think she could do a great job.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and the Bling Ring in a way is a crime film, but yeah.
Yeah, but like a detective, you know, the Bling Ring is all for me. I remember emerging from the cinema and standing on the pavement and thinking, I don't feel anything. She has genuinely created a completely unmoving, amoral film, and I've never experienced anything like it. It's an absolute work of genius.
I would agree. Good. Any other ideas?
I wouldn't mind seeing how she lends her aesthetic to a horror film. That could be interesting. I assume it would probably be a quite understated one, but yeah.
Well, and wouldn't you say there's elements of horror in the Beguiled, and also wouldn't you say the Virgin Suicides?
Yeah, with the Gothic connection, definitely. But if she just could go full tilt with it, maybe, and see what she comes up with there.
Yeah. Anna.
I've always wanted her to adapt a Shirley Jackson novel, because I've read Hangs a Man twice now, and there's one called The Bird's Nest as well, which I can really envisage as a Sofia Coppola film. I think she could also adapt one of Jean Rhys's novels. I think like just the relentless down and out depression of that in a kind of dusty, faded, yet still slightly glamorous Paris. I can really see her doing that as well. But I mean, I wonder, I'm really looking forward to The Custom of the Country. And I'm also wondering whether Priscilla will be a musical. I mean,
that's interesting.
It's really funny that Baz Luhrmann was like, oh, if she wants to talk or wants any advice, she can reach out to me. And Sophia's just like, no.
Well, and I think that was going to be one of my other questions, is that she is working now on The Custom of the Country. And you raised the issue that many of her films are adaptations of either novels or other. It's not The Beguiled was a response to a film. I wouldn't say an adaptation of another film, but she does do adaptations. The Priscilla, what I know about the Priscilla film was she filmed it in Toronto in the fall. She went back to Toronto where she filmed The Virgin Suicides, and she sent out now she's on Instagram, which is another thing to talk about. And she sent out a playlist of things that she was listening to. And I know that they restaged the exteriors of Graceland, but I suspect that it's all production. So music, of course, as we've been discussing, is going to be a key to the movie, but that's an interesting idea. Could she do a full-on musical? I don't know. Caryn is saying
Spinal Tap
version of a female rock band, which she paved the way for in Lick the Star, right, Cynthia? So, yeah. Okay. One of the things that I think that we've been talking about, and I think we can all agree, even though, as Jamie has pointed out, there are serious criticisms of her, is that she has been, until recently, very valued, right? Here's a woman who's got 30 years of work, if we include her early work, 20 years, more than 20 years of filmmaking behind her. There's all of these books now. Our book, there's A Critical Companion, there's Hannah Strong's book, Hannah Strong book. Of course, Anna's written a full-length book, Fiona Handyside, who is in the handbook, who couldn't join us. So there's a lot of attention to her works. And I think that we're all in agreement that there should be. What prevents her from having any of her films highlighted beyond Lost in Translation on things like Sight and Sound's list or AFI's list or any of the lists? What should be on there, and why isn't she getting them considered?
I would just say that I don't teach the first years anymore, but I'll never forget a session where I taught Marie Antoinette to first years, and this chap who's gone on to do a PhD now, but he said to me, oh, when he saw there was Sofia Coppola, he thought, oh no, I can't bear it. It's also girly, it's also pathetic, and like white broderie anglais, like a Timothée advert, and he became an absolute devotee. He became completely obsessed with her films, and as I say, was like electrified by them. So I think there's a lot of there's a resistance towards before even watching some of her films because of the aesthetic and because she's a Coppola. I've always thought it's a sort of hatred of overt femininity without giving it the time to be subverted.
And not looking beneath the surface of the image, as Anna said. Yes, Justin.
To me, part of what's going on, I completely agree. She's undervalued in a major way. And, the people on this call and in the book are helping to remedy that. But to me, some of these films are just very abstract. I mean, I would call them in some ways experimental films that critics aren't able to engage with directly. Like when Todd was talking about one of my favorites, apart from Virgin Suicides, is Somewhere, which I think is an extraordinary film about space. That's something that a lot of people wouldn't engage with, a lot of popular critics wouldn't engage with. So I just think she's working on a different level compared to a lot of other directors, and it goes missing,
Well, we also know that the data has been collected, and this is partly to the point of Jamie's chapter, but also the gender conversation is that most critics are white men. I mean, I think it's something like 78% are men and 88% are white. I mean, or I may have, at any rate, it works. So I think that until there's a change, and that is slowly happening, but until there's a change in who is controlling the 10 best lists, it is going to be an issue.
Yes, and I mean, I think I was going to say as well, and I'm sure some of you would agree that the recognition of women's films, female filmmakers, in and of itself leaves much room to be desired. I know there's several projects going on that really, again, want to revisit the history of cinema through female filmmakers. But for me, I think one of the things that is quite difficult with Sofia Coppola's work is on first appearance, they seem very much sort of actors' films. They seem very infatuated with the stars at the center of these films. And I'm not in no means sort of saying that that's not worthy of celebration in and of itself. But what strikes me is that Sofia Coppola is in fact a very sort of film literate filmmaker. And you're right to point out that The Bling Ring is a sort of heist film, but it's also a teen film, and it's also a sort of social media film, and it's all these things. And I think that in order to be able to spot all of that kind of literacy and that incredible kind of meta reflection that she does, when she herself doesn't talk about it, right? She doesn't necessarily give interviews where she, boasts about that kind of knowledge. It requires a kind of more patient, simmering viewer who really then wants to let that breathe. And that's not necessarily a kind of in a film critic world what gets places quickly. So I hope like Ackerman, because we shouldn't forget Ackerman is now #1, that she will be a slow simmer and that her work will be recognized as time passes on.
Well,
if I can just piggyback on that really quickly, I think particularly because she's a woman director in the same way of what she's just saying there, that when there's so much set up against any woman director, anybody of color to begin with. Then when those movies then get highlighted on the kind of list you're talking about, it's because they do exactly what the critical establishment wants them to do. They're very overt and obvious, and they're political, and they can pat themselves in the back and go, look how we're recognizing women filmmakers, look how we're recognizing people of color, look how we're recognizing whatever group we normally overlook. And her films never do that. They're always nuanced, they're always ambiguous, they always take a tough, difficult reading of an issue that I think it's sometimes liked by critics when it's a white male director, but it's never what's held up as the feminist movie or what's held up as the race movie because it's not so overt. And you see this with race, right? Like I think really god-awful movies like Crash get held up, and movies that have really nuanced, interesting things to say about race don't, because when Hollywood wants to pat itself on the back for being so liberal, it really means what they imagine liberal to be, which is normally pretty neoliberal and not really that radical at all.
Yeah.
And using Marie Antoinette as an example, I know that it's just that it's actually a radical film in terms of what it is, maybe her most radical film, but because it's lost on the surface, it's easy to dismiss. And I don't think it would get dismissed if they weren't already set up to dismiss it.
Yes, yes. Well, okay, and let me piggyback on that. Sorry, Lucy had to go because she's feeling badly. Bye, Lucy. In the book, Kata Paskowitz takes on that whole idea of the critical reception. So that's very interesting. And she wasn't with us today, but Nicole Richter's chapter on Marie Antoinette really picks up on a lot of the things that you were just saying, Todd, about that film and what Lucy said at the beginning. But Yannis has had his hand up very politely. So Yannis, it's your turn.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think this is a really interesting question, and clearly we can see the range of responses about why this is the case. I would add something else. I would add the relationship to Francis Ford Coppola. I mean, if you see any top 10 lists, you will see Francis Coppola there. So I did make the point that she basically established herself away from the shadow of her father, and we are all very much we all very much know that. However, in the critical establishment, especially in the top 10 list or top 100 as a sight and sound and everything, Francis tends to dominate, and and I think it's very difficult to actually see a second Coppola sneaking in, even though her films couldn't be further removed from the films of Francis Coppola. And also, I think it's very interesting that I think Coppola is very much a contemporary filmmaker, and I think kind of assessing contemporary filmmakers' work is very difficult because of the various groups and subgroups that actually look at these things these days. If you look though, from somebody like Francis Ford Coppola, he is like a titan of cinema, and therefore he deserves to be there. I think younger people, they see things differently. They see things. I mean, yes, Mary said about teen films and social media films and so on. They see things differently, and I think Sofia has much bigger future in terms of becoming an established, if you like, figure, especially now that she's approaching 50, and that's the time when quite a lot of people are being canonized even more.
Amy, is that you? Thank you, Yannis. Amy, is that you? Amy Monahan has joined us, and she gave a thumbs up to that and to the idea.
I'm going to be shamelessly flacking this for a hot second, but I did also want to mention that Sofia is over 50 now. Remember, she was born in 71 and was just old enough to play Corleone's, christened child. Yeah.
Son.
Going back to genre, I am also looking forward to The Custom of the Country, but when I was able to interview Sofia, we talked a little bit about the glam miniseries, which is a phrase that has come up, I'm sure, if you've read various of her interviews. And she particularly invoked lace, which has the sort of canonical line, "Which one of you bitches is my mother?" And I really kind of want a potboiler sort of just like, forget subtlety, go for broke. But the other thing I was sort of thinking about with hearing all of these wonderful things, and I'm so excited, is that I have been working on this volume a long time. Mostly and I think Suzanne may have seen in the intro, I stalked this contract like I was stalking Bill Murray, because I taught a class in 2013 that was the cinema of extended adolescence. And I looked at Wes Anderson and Sofia Coppola where they were then, and she was so lauded and there was nothing. And, you know, of course, Wes Anderson looks like a white male film critic. And they're all numbers of, like, you know, special journal issues and all of this stuff. So I'm just so excited about this wonderful handbook, because when I tried to do this, you know, 10 years ago, it was so lonesome, and I had to, you know, like sort of figure out how to cobble together some ideas. I mean, I think like Todd I definitely had his work in there, but yeah, just an enormous thank you to all of you, and also especially to Suzanne for, I guess you also have your Google alert set to Sofia Coppola or something, but
yes.
But for inviting me to take part in this, because this is something that even 5 years ago seemed like it would just never happen. So thanks everyone for all of your stuff. And if you are not in my you know, other resources section of my collection, just remember Sofia is only like 51, which means it will be a, you know, a revised and expanded edition. So keep writing so I can put all of your work in there too.
Yeah, well, and thank you, Amy, and thank you for joining us. And I think your book is going to be an excellent companion to our book, because she's got all of these first-person interviews, many of which we've all cited in our work, but they're all assembled in one volume, and including one that Amy did herself, a more recent one. So I think as a teaching resource, it's going to be phenomenal, and also a research for scholars, which we were hoping our book was too. Okay, I'm going to end with this. And I know we've gone over the formal meeting time, so if you have to leave, please, you know, don't linger, but you're welcome to stay, because my final question would be, thank you that you said the new version, because I'm assuming there's going to be I'm already thinking there's going to be another expanded version of the handbook. We'll have to, you know, add things. Okay, so what did we not, even though I know it's the most comprehensive collection that you could possibly have about Sofia Coppola's works out of the handbook? Okay, what did we leave out? What is worth talking about in Coppola that we didn't talk about? Taking a cue from Jamie, right? What's like unseen? What is remaining unsaid about Coppola's works?
I suppose there could be a chapter dedicated to sexuality, sexual identity, social identity.
That's a very good idea.
Definitely. I mean, I agree with that, and I think in my chapter I just hint at what she leaves out in terms of woman, that she says she puts woman center stage, but what kind of woman is that? Tends to be cisgender woman, and how the faces of Chanel affords her a little bit of flexibility with that, how she represents the women of Chanel to be a little bit more inclusive, but very, albeit quite limited. So I absolutely agree is how she, how her representation might be more expansive and inclusive generally.
Okay, good, great idea. Other ideas?
Can I jump in? I think a chapter addressing masculinity, so kind of turning the way that we're approaching this work would be really fascinating.
Yeah, and there's a book that's called A Critical Companion to Sofia Coppola that is out from Lexington Press that I read recently. They do talk about that to some degree. So yes, that's I think many of us have gone to pains to say that it's not just focused on women, although they are the center, but that it's about relationships between men and women, but masculinity alone, yes. Okay, Maryn, and then Sara, and then Anna. Okay, Maryn.
I'm really
I was going to say, I think that, oh, sorry. that I always like a chapter that kind of counter argues the argument of the book, which really, if this is an auteurist study, could we look at the kind of perhaps collaborative aspect of her filmmaking process, which I think that she particularly is indebted a lot of the time to her cinematographers. And I wonder whether she herself would actually present herself, and I'm curious to read your interviews, Amy, as a collaborative filmmaker. So that might be an interesting addition. So a chapter that really looks at her filmmaking process and her collaborations to kind of counter argue the auteurist tendency, which from a feminist perspective, incidentally, is also an important argument to make, right? So
yes. Yeah. Okay, and I think that that's great. And I would point out, I'm sorry you couldn't join us, Cameron Bale, who's a filmmaker, has a whole chapter about her collaboration with the cinematographers, and it's eye-opening. So yes, but I agree that then there could be like beyond that. And we touch on that in the production design, but you're right, a whole chapter itself. Okay, Sarah, and then Anna.
Yes, my comment has a lot to do with Maryn. I share a lot of interest with Maryn, actually, starting from the Bling Ring, because the Bling Ring was, my encounter, deep encounter with Sofia Coppola, and accidental, totally accidental. I think, a point of interest might be family, which intersects what Maryn just said, because, her entourage is made of, liaison, of close friends, but family, her brother, her mother, forget about his father for a second, but, a lot of members, her cousin, other members, that come together in her imagination or in the process of, making, developing an idea for a project, for a film. And I'm really looking forward to this collection of interviews, because I assume there will be a lot, because she talks about her mother. And I found really inspirational what she says about her mother, especially because her mother appears this silent figure in the background, that but a witness of a lot of things. Once the last thing about family and music, family and opera. So there's a lot in her, familiar background that can, bring deep perspective on her work.
And take it on in a way that's not related to charges of nepotism, the things that Yannis was mentioning. Yes. Excellent. Good idea. Anna.
Oh, I just wanted to go back to the masculinity thing and shamelessly plug the second chapter of my book on Coppola, which is on masculinity. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that we have in our individual works touched on the topic, and so it is definitely deserving of a chapter of its own. So I'm so glad that we have other things we can possibly talk about. Okay, but I know we could talk about this all day, but we have busy lives, and I know it's late for some of you, early for some of us, right, Cynthia? Cynthia Felando. It's early for us on the West Coast, but I can't thank you all enough. Those of you who contributed, those of you who participated, this has been just such a wonderful event. I'm so happy to have worked on this project with all of you, and I'm sure we will stay in touch.